January 17, 1944, 29,000 feet above the frozen farmlands of Bavaria, the air was thin enough to kill a man in seconds. Inside the plexiglass nose of a B-17 flying fortress named Maiden's Prayer, Second Lieutenant James R. Howard could see his breath crystallizing against the oxygen mask strapped to his face. The temperature outside had dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Ice crystals clung to the aluminum skin of the bomber like a second, brittle armor. Below, the patchwork fields of southern Germany stretched out in winter whites and grays, serene and indifferent to the war being waged in the stratosphere above. Howard was 23 years old. He had been in combat for less than 2 months. His logbook showed only 14 missions, barely enough to earn the faded leather jacket and the tired eyes that marked the veterans of the 8th Air Force. Yet, on this frozen morning, as the formation of B-17s droned toward their target, a Messerschmitt factory near Augsburg, Howard would be thrust into a moment that defied every lesson taught in flight school, every tactic drilled into young pilots at bases across England. He would face not one, not two, but a swarm of Luftwaffe fighters descending on his formation like wolves on wounded prey. And he would do something so audacious, so contrary to doctrine, that German pilots would later struggle to explain what they had witnessed. The war in the skies over Europe had, by early 1944, become a war of mathematics and metal. The American strategy was brutal in its simplicity. Send waves of heavy bombers deep into the Reich, protected by layers of fighter escorts, and bleed the Luftwaffe dry. The cost was staggering. In the autumn of 1943, the 8th Air Force had lost more than 600 bombers in 3 months. Entire crews, 10 men per aircraft, were swallowed by the cold European sky, their fortresses tumbling earthward in flames or spiraling into the frozen earth below. The odds of surviving a tour of 25, missions hovered around 1 in 4. For the men who climbed into those bombers each morning, the sky was not a place of freedom. It was a gauntlet. The P-51 Mustang, the long-range fighter that would eventually turn the tide, was only just beginning to arrive in significant numbers. On this January morning, the escort fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts, could only accompany the bombers partway before their fuel ran low, and they were forced to turn back. That left a window, a deadly gap of 30 to 40 minutes, during which the bombers flew naked and alone into the heart of Germany. The Luftwaffe knew this. They waited. And when the American fighters peeled away, waggling their wings in silent farewell, the German interceptors came. Howard had expected fear. He had expected the dry mouth, the hammering heart, the way time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously when tracer rounds stitched the air around your canopy. What he had not expected was the silence. When his radio died, killed by static, jamming, or some electrical gremlin in the cold, he found himself cut off from the rest of his flight, unable to hear the frantic calls of bomber crews under attack, unable to coordinate with the handful of other escort fighters still struggling to protect the formation. In the cockpit of his P-51, alone at the edge of the world, Howard became a solitary actor in a sky filled with chaos. He had been told over and over that a lone fighter was a dead fighter. The doctrine was clear: stay with your flight, maintain formation discipline, protect each other's tails. But doctrine assumed your radio worked. Doctrine assumed you could hear your leader's commands, could coordinate attacks, could call for help. Without that lifeline, Howard was left with only his eyes, his instincts, and a burning awareness that the bombers he was supposed to protect were being torn apart. The Luftwaffe had scrambled everything they had that day. Bf-109s, sleek and fast, climbed up, from their bases with orders to break the American formation. FW-190s, heavy-nosed and brutal, positioned themselves for head-on attacks, the tactic that struck the most fear into bomber crews. A head-on pass gave the German pilot only seconds to fire, but those seconds could shred a B-17's cockpit, killing the pilots instantly and sending the bomber into an uncontrolled dive. The bomber crews called it going down in the first 3 seconds. There was no bailout, no time to think, just fire, impact, and gravity. Howard saw them coming. A flight of 6 Bf-109s, then another, then more. Too many to count in the seconds he had to react. They were setting up for a coordinated attack, a classic Luftwaffe maneuver, multiple fighters diving from different angles, saturating the defensive fire of the bombers, overwhelming the gunners who swiveled their 50 caliber machine guns in desperate arcs. Howard's own fighter, a P-51B, nimble and fast, but still a newcomer to the European theater, was outnumbered by an order of magnitude. He had, at most, enough ammunition for a few bursts. Against 12 or more enemy fighters, it was a laughable mismatch. The German pilots expected him to run, or to pick a single target, make a pass, and dive away before they could converge on him. That was what American pilots did when outnumbered: hit and run, preserve the fighter, live to fly another day. But Howard did not run. He turned into them. The maneuver had no name in the training manuals. It was not taught at flight school, not diagrammed in the tactical briefings given to young lieutenants fresh from the States. But it had a logic, a brutal, elegant logic born of desperation and clarity. If the German fighters were setting up for an attack on the bombers, they were flying predictably, following a choreographed approach that left them vulnerable. Howard positioned his Mustang not to intercept them in a classic dogfight, but to disrupt their geometry. He flew directly into their attack vector, forcing them to choose: continue their run on the bombers and risk a collision with him, or break off and deal with the madman flying headlong into their formation. They broke off. The first pair of 109s split left and right, their pilots yanking their sticks hard enough to gray out their vision. Howard flashed between them, close enough to see the rivets on their fuselages, the black crosses on their wings. He fired a short burst, more to announce his presence than to score a hit. And then he was through, pulling up in a climbing turn that brought him around for another pass. Behind him, the German pilot struggled to reorient, to figure out where the lone American had gone and what he intended to do next. He intended to do it again. Over the next 30 minutes, Howard repeated the same insane maneuver again and again. He flew into the teeth of each German attack, disrupting formations, forcing overshoots, turning coordinated strikes into chaotic scrambles. The Bf-129 pilots, trained to exploit numerical advantage, found themselves scattering to avoid mid-air collisions, with a single fighter who refused to play by the rules. Some tried to engage him directly, pulling into tight turns to get on his tail, but Howard used the Mustang's superior roll rate and energy retention to slip away, repositioning for another head-on pass at the next wave of attackers. He was not trying to shoot them all down. He did not have the ammunition or the time. He was trying to buy seconds, seconds for the bombers to stay in formation, seconds for their gunners to adjust their aim, seconds for the formation to survive. The bomber crews, watching from their gun positions, could not believe what they were seeing. In the waist gun position of Maiden's Prayer, Staff Sergeant Tom Carlson would later tell a reporter that he thought the lone Mustang pilot had gone completely crazy or completely genius, maybe both. Every time a swarm of 109s lined up for an attack, the lone fighter appeared like a wasp at a picnic, forcing the Germans to scatter. The bomber gunners did not know the pilot's name. They did not know his radio was dead, that he was acting without orders or coordination. They only knew that someone, somewhere, was keeping them alive. The historical record shows that Howard's ammunition ran out after the first 10 minutes. He kept flying. He kept making his passes, bluffing attacks with an empty gun, using the mere threat of his presence to disrupt the German formations. The Luftwaffe pilots, unable to communicate effectively due to the same radio jamming that had silenced Howard, did not realize he was out of ammunition. They saw a fighter that should have fled or died, but instead kept coming. Some accounts suggest that several German pilots, low on fuel and unnerved by the relentless aggression, broke off their attacks entirely and returned to base. By the time the bombers reached the relative safety of Allied-held airspace, Howard had forced more than a dozen Luftwaffe fighters to abandon or abort their attacks. Not a single bomber from the formation he had been protecting was lost to the fighter assault. The official report filed by the bomber group commander noted simply, "One P-51 pilot provided exceptionally aggressive escort. Enemy fighters repelled. Identity of pilot unknown at time of report." Howard landed back at his base in England with his fuel tanks nearly dry and his gun bays empty. When the ground crew opened his camera gun footage, a small film camera mounted in the wing that recorded whenever the trigger was pulled, they found only a few seconds of film. The rest was blank. Howard had been flying and fighting for half an hour, But for most of that time, he had been firing nothing but bluff and will. The German pilots who survived that mission filed their own reports. Several mentioned a lone American fighter that did not fight like others, that forced overshoots repeatedly, and that ignored tactical sense. One Luftwaffe pilot, interviewed after the war, recalled the incident and admitted, "We thought there were more. The way he flew, the way he kept appearing, it seemed impossible for one aircraft." That confusion, that momentary disbelief, had been enough to fracture the German attack. There was something uniquely American in Howard's audacity, something that transcended tactics and technology. The Luftwaffe pilots were superbly trained, their aircraft among the finest in the world, their tactics honed by years of combat over Europe, North Africa, and the Eastern Front. They flew with precision and discipline, relying on coordination and numerical superiority. But Howard, the rookie with the dead radio, had introduced an element they were not prepared for: improvisation born of abundance. Not abundance of resources, his ammunition was spent, his fuel nearly gone, but abundance of belief. The belief that the rules could be rewritten in the moment. The belief that aggression and audacity could substitute for firepower. The belief that one man, in the right place at the right time, could change the outcome. This was the paradox of the American war effort. The United States had entered the war late, its pilots undertrained compared to their Axis counterparts, its doctrines still evolving, but it brought with it an industrial and psychological abundance that reshaped the calculus of air combat. American pilots were taught to be aggressive, to press attacks, to trust that if they were shot down, another pilot and another plane would take their place. There was no cult of the ace, no reverence for the lone hero, because the system itself was the hero, the endless stream of bombers and fighters pouring out of factories in Detroit and Seattle and Long Beach, the pipeline of young men willing to climb into those machines and fly into the flak-torn skies over Europe. Howard's lone stand was not an aberration. It was an expression of that abundance, translated into action by a single pilot who refused to accept the mathematics of his situation. The symbolism of the empty gun, firing nothing, yet still driving back the enemy, would echo through the remaining years of the war. It appeared in the propaganda posters that urged Americans to buy war bonds, in the letters that pilots wrote home, in the quiet conversations between veterans decades later. It was the idea that even when the material advantage ran dry, the psychological edge remained. The willingness to keep coming, to keep fighting, to refuse defeat even when logic suggested otherwise. That was the weapon that no amount of engineering or training could replicate. Howard's actions that day earned him the Medal of Honor, the only fighter pilot in the European theater to receive the nation's highest decoration for a mission flown entirely alone. The citation praised his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. But the men in the bombers he had saved needed no citation to remember. For them, the lone Mustang that kept appearing again and again was a kind of miracle, a reminder that in the vast and different sky, someone was watching over them. In the years after the war, military historians would study Howard's engagement as a case study in asymmetric tactics. Fighter pilots would debate whether his actions were brilliant or suicidal, whether they could be codified into doctrine, or whether they were simply the unrepeatable product of a specific moment, a specific pilot, and a specific set of circumstances. But beneath those debates lay a deeper truth, one that Howard himself struggled to articulate in interviews. He had not planned what he did. He had not calculated the odds or weighed the risks in any formal sense. He had simply seen what needed to be done and done it, trusting that his aircraft, his training, and his will would be enough. That trust, that refusal. To be paralyzed by fear or probability was perhaps the greatest gift the American system gave its fighting men. It was not arrogance, though it could look like it from the outside. It was a kind of inherited optimism, a belief drilled into the national consciousness by a century of expansion, innovation, and second chances. Other nations had longer military traditions, deeper reservoirs of tactical knowledge, more experienced soldiers. But America had something else, the belief that the impossible was merely difficult, and the difficult merely required effort. Howard, the rookie with the dead radio, had embodied that belief at 29,000 feet above Bavaria, and for 30 minutes he had held back the storm. The Luftwaffe never adapted a counter-tactic to what Howard had done, because there was no tactic to counter. His method relied on unpredictability, on the willingness to do what no rational pilot should do. You could not train for it, could not plan against it, because it existed, only in the moment of execution. It was jazz in a world of symphonies, improvisation in a realm of rigid scores, and like jazz, it was distinctly, undeniably American. When the bombers of the 8th Air Force returned to their bases that evening, the ground crews counted the holes in the fuselages, tallied the wounded, and marked the empty hard stands where aircraft had failed to return. It was a ritual repeated every day of the air war, a grim accounting of metal and men. But on this day, one formation had come back whole. The crews climbed out of their aircraft, their flight suits stiff with dried sweat and frost, and they looked up at the sky as if searching for the lone fighter that had kept them alive. Most would never learn his name, but they would remember the way he flew, reckless, relentless, impossible, and they would tell the story to anyone who would listen. In the decades that followed, James Howard would be asked again and again why he did what he did, why he did not retreat when the odds became overwhelming, why he kept attacking even after his ammunition ran out, why he risked everything for bombers he had never seen before, crews whose names he did not know. His answers were always modest, almost dismissive. "It seemed like the thing to do," he would say, or, "I didn't think about it much at the time." But those who knew him understood that his modesty concealed a deeper truth. He had done what he did because he believed, fundamentally, that his life was not more valuable than the lives of the men in those bombers. That democracy, for all its flaws and contradictions, was built on the idea that every individual mattered and that protecting that idea was worth any risk. The empty gun became a symbol not of futility, but of defiance. It represented the moment when material advantage ended and moral conviction began. It was the line between a soldier who fought because he was told to and a warrior who fought because he chose to. And in that choice, in that split-second decision to turn into the enemy rather than away, Howard had crossed from mere duty into something larger. He had become, without intending to, an embodiment of the ideals his nation claimed to fight for. Not perfection, not invincibility, but the stubborn, irrational refusal to surrender in the face of impossible odds. The frozen sky above Bavaria did not care about ideals. It did not care about nations or ideologies, about freedom or tyranny. It was indifferent, vast, and lethal. But into that indifference, human beings brought meaning. They brought courage and fear, calculation and improvisation, discipline and chaos. And on rare occasions, they brought moments of such clarity and audacity that the sky itself seemed to bend around them, if only for a little while. James Howard's moment lasted 30 minutes, but the echo of it would ripple through the remainder of the war and into the decades beyond. It would be told and retold, each retelling adding a layer of myth until the raw facts of the engagement, the dead radio, the empty gun, the lone fighter against the swarm, became a story that transcended the specifics. It became a parable about the nature of courage, about the power of individual action in a war defined by industrial scale, about the way a single person, in the right place at the right time, could alter the course of history. The Luftwaffe pilots who faced Howard that day returned to their bases shaken. They had been trained to expect American pilots to be skilled but predictable, aggressive but bound by doctrine. Howard had been none of those things. He had been something they could not categorize, could not prepare for. And in their confusion, in the brief hesitation before each attack as they searched the sky for the lone Mustang, they had given the bombers the seconds they needed to survive. That hesitation, that momentary loss of confidence, was the crack in the armor. It was the beginning of the end for the Luftwaffe's dominance over the skies of Europe. By war's end, the 8th Air Force would have flown more than 300,000 sorties, dropped more than 700,000 tons of bombs, and lost nearly 27,000 airmen. The strategic bombing campaign remains one of the most controversial aspects of the Allied war effort, its effectiveness debated by historians to this day. But for the men who flew those missions, who climbed into the bombers each morning knowing the odds, the question of effectiveness was secondary. They flew because they were asked to, because they believed their sacrifice mattered, and because, on days like January 17th, 1944, someone like James Howard was there to remind them that they were not alone. The sky above Bavaria is quiet now. The farmlands below are green in summer, white in winter, unchanged by the passage of decades. No markers indicate where the air battle took place. No monuments commemorate the moment when a rookie pilot with a dead radio and an empty gun turned the tide. But the story endures, passed down through generations of pilots, a reminder that in the vast machinery of war, there is still room for the individual, still space for the moment when one person, against all logic and expectation, chooses to stand and fight. That is the legacy of January 17th, 1944. Not the tactics, not the technology, but the choice. The choice to turn into the enemy rather than away. The choice to keep fighting even when the ammunition runs dry. The choice to believe that one person can make a difference, even when surrounded by a hostile sky and an ocean of adversity. It was a choice rooted in the abundance of the American spirit, not the abundance of material, but the abundance of hope, of audacity, of the irrational belief that the impossible is merely difficult, and the difficult is merely a challenge waiting to be met. And in that choice, in that frozen moment at 29,000 feet, James Howard did not just save a formation of bombers. He proved that the ideals for which the war was fought, freedom, democracy, the value of the individual, were not just abstractions. They were real, tangible, powerful enough to change the outcome of a battle, powerful enough to echo through the decades, powerful enough to remind us even now that in the face of overwhelming odds, the human spirit, when unleashed, is the most formidable weapon of all. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this historical deep dive, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which historical figure we should cover next.